A family vacation off Florida quickly turned into a nightmare as the captain of a luxury yacht turned on the family renting it. It left 4 out of 5 family members dead and one little girl adrift at sea, her fate uncertain as she bobbed in the waves with no food, no water, and no shelter. Bluebelle was a 60-foot-long ketch, a 2-masted sailboat, launched in 1928 in Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin, and was owned by a man named Harold Pegg. Her home port was Bahia Mar Marina in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. She'd be in service for almost 40 years prior to the final accident. The complement aboard the Bluebelle during the incident consisted of 40-year-old Arthur Duperrault, his wife Jean, 38, and their 3 children, Brian, 14, Terry Jo, 11, and Renee, 7. Arthur Duperrault was a successful contact lens optometrist, and the family lived in Green Bay, Wisconsin. Arthur had long dreams of taking his family on a week-long family cruise from the Florida Keys to the Bahamas, which he'd sailed during his World War II service, as opposed to the family facing another cold Wisconsin winter. The Duperraults spent several years scraping up enough money for this opulent experience and had saved enough by the summer of 1961, and thus they began to make Arthur's dream a reality. They planned to spend a week living at sea aboard a chartered yacht in a warm climate, docking at several chosen locations and possibly extending the sabbatical if they were all having a good time. They arrived in Fort Lauderdale in early November, where they chartered the ketch Bluebelle, stationed at the Bahia Mar Marina for $515. This would be $5,688 in 2026. Arthur hired a well-known local yachtsman and acquaintance, 44-year-old Julian Harvey, to skipper the vessel for $100 a day, which would be $1,104 per day in 2026. Harvey's 6th wife, 34-year-old former stewardess and aspiring writer Mary Dean Harvey, was also appointed to serve as a cook on the ketch for the family's vacation. The Duperraults boarded Bluebelle at around midday on Wednesday, November 8, 1961. The ketch was last seen leaving port early that afternoon. Over the following 4 days, the family traveled to locations like Bimini and Sandy Point, where they purchased souvenirs and engaged in activities such as snorkeling. On November 12th, at their final port of call, prior to returning to Florida, Arthur and Captain Harvey visited the office of British District Commissioner Roderick Pinder, to whom Arthur stated, quote, "This has been a once-in-a-lifetime vacation," adding, "We'll be back before Christmas." That evening, all aboard Bluebelle ate a meal of chicken cacciatore and salad. Shortly thereafter, 11-year-old Terry Jo walked below deck to her sleeping cabin, as the rest of her family and the Harveys remained on deck. At approximately 12:35 p.m. on Monday, November 13th, a crew member aboard the oil tanker Gulf Lion observed a man waving frantically from a dinghy drifting in their direction and shouting, "Help! I have a dead baby on board." Pulling the man aboard, crew members observed the deceased body of a red-haired prepubescent girl wearing a life jacket inside the dinghy. The man identified himself as Julian Harvey. Harvey explained that at approximately 8:30 p.m. the previous evening, his small vessel was hit by a sudden strong squall that caused Bluebelle to rapidly keel over and the main mast to snap at a location between the Abaco Islands and Great Stirrup Cay, slightly injuring his wife and Arthur and piercing the ship's hull. According to Harvey, he was completely separated from all others on board the ketch by this falling mast and the resultant loose rigging, which pulled down the mizzen mast. He attempted to retrieve a wire cutter from the cabin to clear the deck space, but a sudden fire broke out on board the small vessel, and he was not able to rescue his wife or any of the passengers. Forced to abandon the vessel alone on a dinghy, the body of 7-year-old Renee floated by, and he had retrieved her body and attempted to revive her. Unsuccessful in this, he kept her body alongside him in the raft out of respect. A later autopsy reveals she drowned. Taken to Nassau, he was questioned by authorities. His calm demeanor and the fact his dinghy had been filled with various survival supplies caused some to doubt his claims, but his story could not be disproven, so he was sent back to Miami for further questioning by the U.S. Coast Guard on November 15th. Thank you so much to our YouTube members and patrons. If you'd like to have some awesome perks like episodes a full day in advance, join our YouTube memberships today. 3 days after the incident on November 16th, a child was rescued in the Northwest Providence Channel by the Greek freighter Captain Theo. Second Officer Nikolaos Spakadakis observed her floating aboard a 2 by 5 foot cork float approximately 1 mile from the freighter. Spakidakis immediately summoned Captain Stylianos Kortsodontis to the bridge, and the two gradually realized his sighting was not a fishing vessel but a small, oblong white raft carrying a young blonde-haired girl dressed in a white cotton blouse and pink corduroy slacks, leaning backward and waving feebly. The captain ordered the freighter's engine stopped and a life raft lowered. Noting sharks circling close to the cork float, crew members shouted at the child not to jump into the water, while one crew member lifted her aboard the raft. She was then hoisted aboard Captain Theo and placed in his spare cabin. Aboard the freighter, the crew discovered the girl was incoherent and hardly able to speak. She was given water and orange juice as salt was sponged from her body with wet towels and Vaseline was applied to her cracked lips. She hoarsely identified herself as none other than 11-year-old Terry Jo Duperrault. She told the crew she'd floated on the cork float for several days after the sinking of her vessel. Her ability to speak rapidly waned, and she soon responded to questions by weakly gesticulating before lapsing into a semi-comatose state. The crew of the Captain Theo did not retrieve the cork float upon which Terry Jo had drifted. However, a member of the Coast Guard found it and retrieved it several days later. The crew of Captain Theo informed the Coast Guard of their discovery and Terry Jo's medical predicament, and a rescue helicopter was soon summoned. Terry Jo, suffering from severe sunburn, dehydration, and exposure, was airlifted to a Miami hospital in a critical condition. There she began to slowly recover, although for over 2 days she was unable to divulge to police or the Coast Guard the circumstances surrounding her rescue and the truth of what happened aboard the Bluebelle. But eventually, she would. And here's what she said happened. By November 20th, Terry Jo had regained sufficient strength to reveal to investigators the truth about the loss of Bluebelle and its passengers. Late on November 12th, Bluebelle began its return journey to Fort Lauderdale. At around 9 p.m., Terry Jo had entered the lower cabin to sleep, leaving her parents, siblings, Harvey, and his wife on deck. Later that evening, she was awakened by the sounds of her brother screaming and calling for their father, and heavy footfalls, which she decided to investigate. Above deck, she observed the dead bodies of her brother and mother in the main cabin, not far from the galley. Walking further onto the deck, Terry Jo then observed Harvey carrying a bucket. He simply struck her, then shoved her below deck, shouting, "Get back down there!" The terrified child returned to her cabin only to observe oil and water begin to gush onto the floor of her cabin approximately 15 minutes later. Harvey then entered her cabin with what appeared to be a rifle in his right hand. The two made eye contact, but Harvey did not shoot her. He simply returned above deck. Terry Jo then heard hammering sounds. Shortly thereafter, Terry Jo was forced to abandon her rapidly flooding cabin. She returned to the deck only to observe Harvey standing on the deck and the vessel's dinghy floating on the port side. He then asked her, quote, "Is the dinghy loose?" To which she replied she did not know. Harvey then ordered her to hold a rope attached to the dinghy while he retrieved something. By the time Harvey returned to the child, the rope had slipped through her fingers. In response, Harvey dove overboard and swam toward the dinghy, abandoning Terry Jo on the sinking vessel. Recollecting the small oblong cork float lashed to the deck, Terry Jo untied this float as the boat deck began to sink beneath the ocean. She then threw the float overboard and swam toward the life raft, pushing the float further into the open water before climbing onto it. She then drifted out to sea for almost 3.5 days without food, water, or shelter. Her life raft had been so small that Terry Jo had to sit upright for the entire ordeal, during which she had repeatedly prayed for rescue. Terry Jo was adamant that the mast of Bluebelle was intact, that there had been no fire aboard the vessel, and that the sea was calm throughout the entirety of the events prior to the sinking. Shortly thereafter, she was informed that Harvey had been picked up alive 3 days prior to herself in a life raft, alongside her dead sister's body, and that the bodies of her parents, her brother, and Harvey's wife had all been lost at sea. On November 16th, Harvey reiterated his story to Coast Guard investigators that a sudden squall had brought down Bluebelle's masts, holing the ship's hull, rupturing the auxiliary gas tank, and starting a fire, the circumstances of which made it impossible for him to rescue his wife or any member of the Duperrault family. Harvey also claimed he had found Renee's body floating in the water and that he had tried unsuccessfully to revive the child. On November 17th, midway through Harvey's scheduled interrogation, he was informed that Terry Jo had been rescued the previous day, and that her condition was improving. His response was to exclaim, "Oh my God," before quickly and calmly adding, "Isn't that wonderful?" A lieutenant, Ernest Murdoch, then informed Harvey that an official investigation into the loss of Bluebelle and her passengers was to be launched that day. Shortly thereafter, Harvey asked to be excused from further interrogation, claiming he was tired and that he wished to speak with his wife's family. His request was granted. Harvey then drove a short distance toward Biscayne Boulevard, where he checked into the Sandman Motel under the assumed name of John Monroe, paying cash for a room. He then penned a 2-page note before committing suicide by cutting his thigh, ankles, and jugular vein with a razor blade in the motel bathroom. He was found by a maid approximately 2 hours later. The note, addressed to a close friend from his days of military service, was found on a dresser within the room adjacent to his body. This note left no explanations or apologies for his actions, but simply ended with the words, quote, "I got too tired and nervous. I couldn't stand it any longer." The note also requested the recipient take care of his 14-year-old son, Lance, and that he was to be buried at sea. It was concluded by the following Coast Guard inquiry that Harvey, a decorated World War II and Korean War veteran, had difficulty holding a job for any length of time, had serious financial problems, and had recently arranged a double indemnity insurance policy on the life of his wife just 2 months after their July 1961 marriage. He also had a history of insurance fraud prior to this, so keep that in mind. Furthermore, just 1 month prior to the Duperrault family chartering Bluebelle, Harvey had been hired by the vessel's owner, businessman Harold Pegg, to take any tourists to sea upon their desired cruises in exchange for $300 a month and free accommodation aboard the ketch. This agreement may have formulated Harvey's plan to murder his wife at sea and then claim that she had vanished, with tourists viewed in his mind as valuable witnesses to corroborate his claims. The Harvey's first chartered clients were the Duperrault family. The conclusion of the inquiry was that Harvey had planned to kill his wife to collect on her $20,000 double indemnity insurance policy, which would yield double the insured sum if she died accidentally. However, Harvey may have been observed by Arthur either in the act of the murder of his wife or the disposal of her body. He had then proceeded to kill Arthur, his wife, and the 2 of his children, who may also have witnessed their parents' murders. Furthermore, Harvey had likely retrieved Renee's body from the ocean to add credibility to his story. In closure, the inquiry concluded that, had Harvey not died at his own hands, he would have been prosecuted for the deaths of all those who had suffered at his hands aboard Bluebelle, and for the assault on Terry Jo. Rest in peace to Mrs. Harvey and the Duperrault family. May they rest easy.